I'm going to run through, I have 10 slides, and I'm going to spend most of the time on the first slide, so I warn you now, but I will be quick because I know I'm standing between you and a break. If you feel you need to go, please leave. I put this slide up for a couple of reasons. I want people to have historical context, but I also want people to understand the absolute power that we have. Are people familiar with the concept of disruptive technology? People have heard that concept. So I see a lot of head shaking. Patient engagement is the disruptive technology of this era. And that's something that's really exciting if you step back and think about it. And I want to give you a little bit of historical context through the lens of the Prescription Drug User Fee Act. Are people familiar with that? I see a few people shaking their heads. It is the mechanism by which we fund FDA to do reviews of drugs, biologics, generics, and devices, a number of different elements. It was first created in 1993, and this started from some very significant patient engagement by the AIDS HIV community, who actually went in, chained themselves to the fence at NIH. They did so at FDA. They did it to a number of biopharmaceutical companies, saying, we want access to experimental drugs. They were saying, these drugs are the only things that could potentially keep us alive. And FDA and the companies were saying, we don't know if they're safe or effective. They said, we'll be dead in 6 months. Let us try. It created what became known as the Early Access or Compassionate Use Program at that time. One of the things that was exciting was they didn't just stop with early access. They really integrated themselves into drug development. And from a patient perspective, it was really important because most patient advocates at this point in time were trying to focus in on delivery system issues. National Health Council and a lot of other groups were at the forefront of health literacy, clear health communication, shared decision making, all of which was going on in the early 90s, all of which largely failed for a variety of reasons. Simply did not get integrated into the delivery system. But we saw success with compassionate use, and we saw that community say, you know what, when we look at the FDA, there's this huge backlog of products that are not getting reviewed. And for the first time, drugs were getting reviewed faster in Europe, and dramatically faster. In many cases, products were coming to market a year before they were coming to market in the U.S. For somebody with HIV or AIDS, that meant you were going to die before you had access to the product. So they pushed for the creation of the Prescription Drug User Fee Act, which allows a company to give money to the FDA in exchange for reviewing of their products. Still a hands-off process. It doesn't buy you an approval. It just allows you to give additional resources to the FDA. So a huge reduction in backlog after 1993. Huge success. In 1998, the HIV/AIDS community came back at the FDA and said, okay, you've reduced the backlog, but we still have a long time lag. We're not doing as well as Europe and Japan and other places where they're reviewing the products faster. And so there was an additional influx of money and an additional set of arrangements made with the FDA. And after 1998, you saw a huge improvement. And now the U.S. is historically the place where products are approved first. And that means we get access to products first. Huge improvements. 2003, the PDUFA agreement, as it's called, focused more on bioterrorism. So this is after 9/11. And there was a lot of emphasis on that. Patient community largely went home at this point. And they did so because we saw huge improvements in HIV and in oncology in particular. We felt like we'd done our job. We then went into PDUFA 4, and some of you have heard me describe the distinction between consumers and patients. Consumers are people who go in and out of the healthcare system as needed. Patients, people with chronic disease and disabilities, use the system until they die. Very, very different perspectives. In PDUFA 4 in 2008, the consumer community stepped in, and they were focused in on safety and efficacy, and they were concerned about people having serious side effects. Absolutely perfectly relevant perspective, but what you saw was this heavy push towards the safety side. And you saw the timelines and the backlog start to tick back up. And the patient community re-engaged after PDUFA for. And one of the things that was really exciting was the patient community, certainly National Health Council and some of the groups in this room, pushed for the FDA to meet with the patient consumer community during the negotiation of the next agreement. A lot of people thought, well, that was kind of crazy. In fact, I was on a panel recently with Teresa Mullins, who was the person charged at FDA with trying to figure out how to do this. And she said, quite honestly, we scratched our head. It was in legislation. We had to do it. We had no idea what we were going to do or what it would look like. What it ended up looking like was it gave the patient community the opportunity to say to the FDA, here's what we want in the agreement. And then we went and lobbied all the biopharmaceutical companies that were negotiating the agreement. And for the first time, we actually got what we wanted into the agreement rather than waiting to go to Congress and ask Congress to do it. It was very difficult to get Congress to do anything, much less get the sort of things we wanted in the agreement. We actually got a number of provisions that included the benefit risk framework, biomarkers, patient-reported outcomes, more resources for rare disease, and perhaps most important, what ultimately became the beginning of the patient-focused drug development program. And I'll describe that in a minute, but also recognize that at this point in time, we're also just past the Affordable Care Act, which was also the creation of PCORI. And in that language, the patient community fought for and got more than 30 specific provisions that said PCORI had to engage patients. They had to look at research in a very, very different way. A lot of these things were part of a coordinated strategy from the patient community to really change the dialogue. We also saw the onset of medical homes, individual care plans, actually in the Affordable Care Act as well. So whether you like it or not, there were a whole host of provisions that were patient-centered there, including PCORI, and now we have PDUFA 5 coming into place. One of the aspects I think was most important about PDUFA 5 was this. FDA was required to hold 20 meetings with patients to understand their perspective on their disease, the burden of disease, the burden of treatments. One of the things that was fascinating is that it was soundly criticized by every stakeholder group. Industry thought it was a waste of money. They had to pay for it. FDA thought it was completely unnecessary. Patient community thought, well, this is crazy. It won't impact approvals of specific products. Nobody liked this. Everybody thought it was a waste of time. Every single meeting that's been held, the FDA has walked away with senior folks from the FDA senior officers as well as the review division saying, what I thought was most important to the patient was wrong every single time. And what that meant was companies and the FDA were focusing in on the wrong problems. Can you imagine? Wrong every single time. That created a shudder throughout the industry, where the industry has started to retool how they engage patients to understand their perspective in drug development. It's changed how FDA is looking at regulatory review. And when you look at what's coming out in PDUFA 6, you're seeing a dramatic shift where there's going to be a number of very specific provisions about patient engagement and drug development. Huge, huge shifts. A lot of this is predicated on the work that's been done here, references to the rubric. You cannot go to any single meeting, whether in the United States or globally, focused on patient engagement where the work of PCORI and even references to this committee are not made. And in fact, Susan, I'm going to call you out. You were at the Patients Power meeting. She was part of a panel. She delivered probably the most quoted quote throughout the meeting, and I won't get it right, and perhaps you can describe it to the group later, but it was the concept of patient engagement was like getting a holiday card. You open the card, you look at it, you try and put it back in the envelope, and you've got glitter everywhere. All over your face, all over your desk, and 5 months later, you still look like you've been hugged by a drag queen. I added that part. Glitter everywhere. That's what happens when you engage patients. It catches onto you and it makes a difference. So I told you this is where we're going to spend most of my time. I think it's critically important we understand where we've been, how PCORI has been a huge component of that, how it has shifted this entire environment, and where it's going to go next. So if I can quickly go through these slides, we met with multiple stakeholders using a very similar model to PCORI at the FDA with senior folks from the FDA, developed a white paper that looks at the challenges and solutions for patient engagement and drug development writ large. We've reconvened that group and are actually developing what will become the first set of guidance for the FDA, and there will actually be multiple guidances coming out. First one in just a short period of time. But where I really want to go is value, and I was really pleased, Kim, you asked the question of Joe on pricing. There's a huge discussion going on in this environment about value and what is it. And I think Joe got it right. Value at the end of the day is a two-sided coin. On the one side, it's what is the clinically important element for patients and their family caregivers. The other side is what does it cost and what is our willingness to pay for it. But when it comes to the value half of that equation, we should be able to agree. And I'm beginning to see the emergence of multiple stakeholders arriving at that consensus. Meanwhile, we're shifting from acute to chronic care. Huge difference, and yet our entire delivery ecosystem is founded on acute care. Doesn't make sense. One of the things that just boggles my mind is 30% of all healthcare costs, 80% of all healthcare costs are driven by 30% of the population. 50% by 5%. Why are we not building healthcare delivery systems that respond to those high costs so that we can reduce that? We still haven't gotten there yet, but there's a recognition we need to do that. And meanwhile, we have NIH pursuing that precision medicine initiative, and we're starting to see drug targets focus in on individual people. Still a small proportion of treatments, but we're moving in that direction, but we're also moving in the direction of aligning preferences with treatments, getting them into the labeling so that a patient can say, among these 5 options, this treatment meets the clinical outcome I want, given the context of my goals, my personal circumstances. Huge opportunity. These frameworks are evolving in the United States. You see a number of them, whether it's ASCO, ICER, Comprehensive Cancer Network, all of them well-intended, all for different purposes, sometimes to inform a decision between a patient and a doctor, sometimes to inform how much a payer should pay for the product. None of them actively engage the patient. Think about that. So what we did at the National Health Council is we brought together, again, a multi-stakeholder group to look at how do we ensure that patients be included in the development of frameworks, but also that the frameworks be patient-centered. And so we did a lot of work on that, but it ultimately resulted in the production of a white paper that was released a couple weeks ago. It's gotten a lot of uptick, but it really looks at patient engagement in the context of planning, drafting, refinement, dissemination, evaluation, update and maintenance, and then elements or domains of the patients, and then specific pieces around it. And so just to give you a couple of examples, we looked at each of these domains from characteristics that would be meaningful in terms of patient engagement in the development of the model, but also in terms of patient-centeredness. One of the things that's been really exciting is that every one of those framework developers has come to us and say they're going to retool their frameworks to figure out how they engage patients. We're very much in the early days of this, but this patient engagement has caught fire, not just in research, not just in drug development, but in the context of developing value frameworks. And one of the things that really gets me excited is we're also moving into quality measure design. We're looking into payment models. We're looking into delivery system designs. We're right back to those early 90s when the patient community said, we want to make the healthcare delivery system patient-centered. And as I said, we failed miserably, but we've been incredibly successful with PCORI, with what's happening in drug development, and this is now moving into a delivery system design. So another 5-10 years, this whole health ecosystem is going to look dramatically different. And with that, I give you a break.